They called me an ungrateful brat the moment I claimed what was rightfully mine. My grandfather left me the $12 million estate. They gave it to my sister, then dragged me out by my hair. This isn't just about money. It's about what happens when the daughter they tried to erase refuses to disappear. If you've ever been punished for standing your ground, comment below. And don't forget to subscribe. It started with the smell of rosemary scones, still warm, just the way Edward used to like them, and ended with my back slamming against the marble steps of Silverfield. I stood in the grand foyer of the house my grandfather had built, hands locked around the handle of the last suitcase I dared to pack. Edward Carter had left this estate, the company, and every dollar of his $12 million legacy to me. His will was unambiguous, his intent crystal clear. But clarity means little to people who believe truth is just a tool to reshape in the service of their entitlement. "Put it down," my mother said sharply, stilettos clicking across the floor like a slow countdown. Barbara Carter hadn't touched a scone or a fact since I was a teenager. "These are my personal belongings," I said, voice low but firm. "This house and everything in it is contested," my father added, stepping in like he always did, at the exact moment control was at stake. "Until the court rules otherwise, you have no standing." I should have walked out then, but I turned. At the top of the stairs, Lillian stood in silk pajamas with that same infuriating smile. "Leaving so soon, Madeline." Her tone was sweet. The venom was not. I didn't answer. I moved toward the door. "Don't you dare walk away from us, you ungrateful brat," Barbara snapped. And then David lunged, his hand twisted in my hair, yanking me back so hard my vision went white. I stumbled, heels scraping the floor. Then I felt the sharp crack of my body hitting the first stair, then the second. I didn't scream. That would have given them what they wanted: hysteria, ammunition, proof I wasn't stable, like the forged reports they'd been building behind closed doors. I gave them silence. Cold, deliberate silence. The rain outside was relentless. David shoved the front door wide and pushed me out like I was an intruder in a life I had built alongside my grandfather. My suitcase flew after me, bursting open across the slick stone. Sweaters, letters, a leather-bound notebook, all scattered. "You are no longer welcome in this house," he said, adjusting his cufflinks like this was a merger he'd just closed. Barbara crossed her arms. "Any attempt to return will be treated as trespassing." Lillian leaned over the railing, still watching, still smirking. I gathered what I could from the wet ground, the pain in my shoulder dull compared to the clarity in my chest. I stood, soaked and shaking, but unbroken. "You'll regret this," I said softly. "Not because of what you've taken, but because you think I won't fight." Then I turned my back on Silverfield, on the house, on the people who raised me to vanish. And I walked toward the only truth that had ever seen me whole. My grandfather's belief that legacy belongs to the one who builds, not the ones who decorate the front page. They say the middle child often feels invisible, but I wasn't the middle child. I was the firstborn, the one who arrived quietly, met every milestone early, and learned, almost instinctively, how to take up less space. Lillian came 5 years later with dimples, drama, and a laugh that made people turn their heads. From the moment she was born, it was as if the world rearranged itself to accommodate her. I wasn't pushed aside. That would have required intention. I was simply overlooked. At her 16th birthday, she unwrapped a white convertible with a red bow nearly the size of her ego. Guests applauded. Our parents beamed. I stood in the back holding a plastic cake knife, one no one had asked me to use. A week later, she crashed the car into a lamppost. My parents blamed the city's lighting. That same year, I received a prepaid gift card for straight A's, $50, no bow. Barbara liked to call Lillian our star. She'd say it at parties, at fundraisers, in rooms full of strangers. She lights up every space, she'd beam. Like we were all in on it, like we all agreed. When Lillian failed biology, they hired a private tutor who charged more per hour than most public school teachers made in a day. When I placed first in statewide math, my father didn't look up from his phone. Is that the one with numbers, he asked, distracted? It wasn't that they hated me. That would have meant feeling something. They just didn't see me. I was the frame around Lillian's spotlight, the helpful daughter, the background detail in a family obsessed with image. Appearances were currency in the Carter household. Lillian was a golden investment. I was a savings bond that they forgot they had. But Edward Carter, my grandfather, saw me, always. He lived in the east wing of Silverfield, surrounded by old books, cigar boxes, and a stubbornness that had earned him both enemies and billions. To others, he was the founder of Carter Maritime. To me, he was the man who taught me the tides. There's my clever girl. He'd greet me, setting aside the Financial Times. Come tell me something new. Every Saturday, he took me sailing on the Eleanor, his aging but elegant yacht. Out on the water, the noise of the world vanished. The sea doesn't care who your parents are, he said once, passing me the wheel. It only listens to competence. And I listened to the wind, to the ropes, to his voice. I learned how to tack, how to read the shift in waves, how to hold steady when everything around me pitched and turned. Later, in his office, he taught me a different kind of navigation, how to read balance sheets, interpret market trends, and anticipate a board's next move. You think like a builder. He told me once, Lillian knows how to shine, but shine fades. Structure doesn't. I was 16 when he said that. At the time, I didn't understand the weight of it. Not really. Not until the day he called me into his study and told me what he'd decided. That the company, the estate, the legacy would be mine. But back then, in those quiet years, he never said I deserved it. He didn't have to. He just kept showing me. He taught me that not all progress feels like forward movement, that sometimes staying your course, especially when no one else believes in it, is the most powerful kind of momentum. That dignity doesn't demand the spotlight. It builds its own foundation, brick by unseen brick. Those lessons sat deep inside me, hidden beneath the bruises of being constantly second. And in time, they became more than lessons. They became armor. Because in a house where I was told to dim my light, my grandfather taught me to build my own lighthouse. Quietly, brick by brick. For the day, I would need to guide myself home. And that day, as I stepped off the porch into the rain with my suitcase torn open behind me, I wasn't thinking about the pain or the humiliation. I was thinking of his voice, calm and certain on the deck of the Eleanor, saying, "Steady hands, Madeline. No one outruns the tide, but you can learn to ride it." So I walked forward, not because they pushed me, but because I knew he would have wanted me to. The day of the reading felt more like a reckoning than a ceremony. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the Silverfield Library, painting gold across the walnut floors where our family once posed for magazine spreads. But there were no cameras that day, just the thick, invisible tension of people waiting to hear how much of someone's life they still owned. Benjamin Holloway, my grandfather's longtime attorney, sat at the head of the table. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was even and low, almost reverent. "This is the last will and testament of Edward Harrison Carter." He cleared his throat and continued. "To my granddaughter, Madeline Claire Carter, I leave all controlling shares in Carter Maritime, the Silverfield estate, and all personal possessions located therein." Silence. Not the gentle kind that settles in a room, but the kind that detonates. I felt it before I saw it. My mother's hand tightening around the stem of her glass. her expression fixed somewhere between disbelief and rage. My father blinked slowly. Once, twice, as if the words were too dense to process. And Lillian, she just stared straight ahead, frozen in a smile that no longer made sense. Benjamin continued. To Lillian Carter, I leave a fixed trust of $2 million, to be dispersed annually over 10 years. Lillian made a sound, something between a laugh and a gasp. 2 million. That's it! Barbara stood up so quickly that her chair screeched against the floor. There must be a mistake, she said sharply. He wasn't in his right mind. He wouldn't have done this willingly. He was, I said quietly. You just weren't listening. My father didn't speak. He leaned back in his chair with the stillness of a man recalculating everything. For a moment, he looked at me like I was a stranger who'd stolen a future he thought belonged to him. The rest of the will blurred in my memory. Minor bequests, a painting left to an art institute, donations to charities Edward once supported, but nothing as consequential as those first 2 paragraphs. And when it ended, no one said a word. They simply stood, adjusted their jackets, and walked past me like I was part of the decor they'd grown tired of pretending to appreciate. That evening, I passed by my father's study and heard the whispers. The door was cracked just enough. She must have manipulated him. Barbara hissed. She was always upstairs with him, talking business. He wasn't stable. You saw his medication list, David murmured. We'll talk to Benjamin. There's still time to challenge. We just need the right angle. I walked away before I could hear more, not because I was afraid, but because I already knew. The fight had begun. Later that night, I sat in Edward's study alone. I opened the leather notebook he told me to keep, the one he'd once filled with stock forecasts and handwritten diagrams of market tides. Inside the front cover, in his blocky script, he'd written one final message. If they come for you, they've already lost. Just hold the line. That line echoed in my chest as the hours passed and the house around me shifted. I noticed small things first. A hallway light, usually left on, suddenly went off. A staff member avoids eye contact. The faint smell of my mother's perfume drifted through the east wing, where she never used to go. By morning, the storm had begun. They weren't just shocked, they were furious. Not because Edward had trusted me, but because they never imagined he would choose me over them. And now, with the fortune and power they believed was theirs slipping through their fingers, they didn't grieve. They strategized. In their eyes, I wasn't a granddaughter. I was an intruder occupying a throne that had always been theirs in theory, if not in law. But Edward had known this might come. That's why he made it ironclad. That's why he left records. And that's why, even though I felt alone in that house, I wasn't. Not really. Because when a man like Edward Carter names you as his heir, it isn't sentiment. It's a declaration. I wasn't chosen to be a symbol. I was chosen to lead. And from that day forward, I understood. I wasn't just protecting an inheritance. I was protecting his intent, his legacy, his truth. It started with a hallway light, the one outside Edward's study. For as long as I could remember, it was always left on. A soft glow that bled into the dark after midnight like a signal of presence. But one night, just days after the will was read, it was off. At first, I told myself it was nothing, a change in routine, a flick of a switch. But then came the others. The code to my office door suddenly failed. I entered it once, twice. On the third try, it finally clicked open. Inside, several folders were missing. Folders Edward had labeled himself transition planning, board contingencies, emergency protocols. I checked the trash. Empty. I opened the backup drive. It had been wiped clean. My fingers trembled as I opened the access logs. The last login hadn't come from me. It was from Benjamin Holloway's account. No timestamp, no details, just a ghost key left behind to remind me someone had been there and wanted me to know it. I brought it up at dinner. The table was set like always candlelight. Silence. The sound of spoons against porcelain. I spoke plainly. Someone accessed my files. Removed records. I'd like to know who. David didn't flinch. He cut into his fillet with the precision of a man trained to separate flesh from bone. This stress isn't good for you. Madeline, you should talk to someone. Maybe Dr. Mendelsohn. Your mother found him very helpful during her transition. I'm not imagining this. No one said you were, Barbara added, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. But grief manifests strangely. You've been through a lot. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Their tone said enough. I was no longer the heir. I was the liability. The next morning, I found Edward's ledger, his meticulous, hand-kept financial journal, left open on the kitchen counter. Its pages, always crisp and clean, had been torn. 3 entries were missing. I asked the housekeeper, a woman who'd known me since I was 7, if she'd seen anything. She didn't meet my eyes. That night, I heard footsteps outside my bedroom. Slow. Too slow for the staff. Too deliberate to be dismissed. I opened the door. No one. Just the hum of the hallway. The lingering scent of my mother's perfume. I started locking my door. 2 nights later, I noticed the lock had been scratched, like someone had tried to force it. My hands stopped trembling after the 3rd night. I stopped reacting. I started recording. The final straw came in the legal room. I walked in expecting silence, order. Instead, I found Benjamin standing at the copier, feeding pages of Edward's medical records. "What are you doing?" I asked. He didn't flinch. "Just organizing the file transfers. These belong in my possession now." "Why?" He smiled. "Practiced. Hollow. Your father requested copies. For a state review." That evening, I returned to my bedroom and found a small envelope placed carefully on my pillow. Inside was a single folded page, a photocopy of a prescription note dated 2 months before Edward's death. Scribbled at the bottom, in handwriting that wasn't the doctor's, were the words, "Monitor for signs of undue influence." I sat on the edge of my bed and opened Edward's notebook again, the one with his plans, his diagrams, his warnings. On the inside cover, I ran my finger across the line I'd already underlined twice. Just hold the line. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. They were creating a narrative, slowly, carefully, with the kind of precision that doesn't just destroy you in court, but discredits you entirely. I was being erased from within my own legacy, rewritten into something fragile, erratic, unstable. A girl not fit to inherit. A woman who couldn't possibly be trusted with a $12 million empire. Not because they could prove it, but because they could suggest it. And sometimes, suggestion is all it takes. Especially when whispered behind closed doors by people who've practiced smiling for cameras their entire lives. But Edward had seen this coming. He hadn't just handed me control. He left me a warning, a line to hold. And now, I understood what he meant. They weren't coming for the fortune. They were coming for the story. And I was the only one left who knew how to tell it. The invitation came not by phone, not by text, but through the intercom. Mr. Alton's voice, usually warm and measured, echoed through the halls of Silverfield with clipped precision. Family meeting, dining room, now, no details, no pretense, just enough civility to veil the command. I already knew what it meant. The light outside Edward's study had stayed off for days now. The staff moved through rooms like guests at a wake, heads down, voices hushed. Files were still missing. My name had disappeared from certain directories, and someone had been whispering lies into the right ears long enough that now they didn't have to whisper at all. When I entered the dining room, the choreography was complete. Barbara sat at the head of the table, arms folded, her pearls stiff against her throat like armor. David stood beside her, the posture of a man who'd stopped pretending to be fair. Lillian lounged by the window, scrolling her phone as if the outcome had already been decided, and she had somewhere better to be. And then there was Benjamin Holloway. No briefcase, no files, just a blank notepad in front of him and a silence that said everything he wasn't allowed to. Barbara was the first to speak. Given the circumstances surrounding your grandfather's health in the months before his passing, we've taken legal steps to ensure the integrity of the estate remains intact. What steps? I asked. Though I already knew. Benjamin cleared his throat. We've filed a formal stay on the transfer of assets, effective immediately. I didn't flinch. And the court sympathetic to our concerns, Barbara replied, her voice sugar-coated poison. This isn't personal, Madeline. It's just caution. Until things are fully resolved, it's no longer appropriate for you to remain in the house. I felt the words land, not like a slap, but like ice down the spine. Slow, icy, final. You're kicking me out, I said quietly. You're free to go anywhere you like, Benjamin added, his tone soft enough to make it sound generous. But Silverfield is under legal protection until further notice. David spoke next, already turning away. You have until this afternoon. No room for negotiation. No space for protest. The meeting wasn't a conversation. It was a performance, one they'd already rehearsed. And I wasn't a participant. I was the problem to be removed. I stood, keeping my hands folded to keep them from trembling. Understood. I said, I'll pack my things. They said nothing else. Didn't look at me. I wasn't a threat. I wasn't even real anymore. Just a formality waiting to be erased. Upstairs. I packed quickly. Just the essentials. Documents. Notebooks. The clothes I needed. I left the things I knew they would contest. Furniture. Jewelry. Family photographs. Even the painting Edward once hung above the fireplace. I didn't have the strength to fight over objects. Not yet. But when I tried to leave, Barbara was already waiting. She stood at the threshold of my bedroom, arms crossed, lips thin. You're not taking anything that doesn't belong to you. These are my clothes, I said. Everything in this house is now contested. I moved past her, dragging my suitcase behind me. She turned and called down the hall. David. He came quickly. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just walked straight toward the suitcase, gripped the handle, and when I held on, he grabbed something else. My hair. I didn't scream. Not when he yanked me backward. Not when my knees hit the hardwood. Not when my spine slammed into the stairs again, one by one. I'd learned by now that silence was sharper than any cry. It cut cleaner. At the bottom. Barbara opened the front door. The rain was already falling. David shoved me outside. My suitcase hit the stone before I did, splitting open again. Sweaters, notebooks, papers, the leather journal, and near the edge, just barely visible beneath the folds of a navy blazer, the small gold watch Edward used to carry everywhere. You are no longer welcome here, David said. I stood slowly, drenched and shaking, but unbroken. My voice was steady. You think this is the end? I said. It's not. It's just the last thing you'll do before everything turns. And I reached for the watch, wiped the rain from its face, and walked out, past the gates, past the gravel, past the shadows of everything they tried to take. I didn't know what was waiting on the other side, but I knew what I was leaving behind. And for the first time in my life, It was no longer mine to mourn. I had packed only what I could carry. Documents Edward had marked with red tabs, the leather-bound notebook he told me never to lose, a few clothes, and the gold pocket watch that had once lived in his palm like it belonged there. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the quiet kind of fury that builds when you've been wronged too many times to name. I zipped the suitcase, stood straight, and stepped into the hallway. I didn't expect goodbye, but I hadn't expected war either. Barbara was already waiting. Arms crossed, lips tight, her back braced against the doorframe like she'd been rehearsing for this moment. "You're not taking that," she said flatly, eyes narrowing toward the suitcase. "These are my belongings," I replied, keeping my tone even. "My clothes, my documents. Everything in this house is now contested." I didn't argue. There was no point. I moved forward, and that was when she called for him. David. The word was small, but it summoned something larger, something practiced. He came down the hall without urgency, without expression. There was no shouting, no raised hand, just a clean, measured grip on the handle of my suitcase. I held on. He pulled harder. When he couldn't pry it loose, he grabbed something else. My hair. He twisted and yanked with a force that knocked the breath from my chest. I lost my footing. My shoulder slammed into the wall. My knees buckled. But I didn't scream. I clenched my jaw and held my silence as he dragged me across the floor like I was something expired, no longer a daughter, barely even human. Barbara stepped aside as he pulled me toward the stairs. The first step caught my spine. The second hit my elbow. By the third, the world had narrowed into shapes and impacts, and the sound of my suitcase thudding behind me. When we reached the base of the stairs, he let go without ceremony. I crumpled to the floor, palms bruised, breath sharp, scalp burning. My mother didn't flinch. She simply opened the front door. Rain slashed across the stone like glass. Cold, relentless. "You are no longer welcome here," David said, adjusting his cuffs as if brushing me off his sleeves. Barbara didn't look at me. Lillian stood by the railing, arms draped lazily over the banister. Her eyes met mine, but she said nothing. Not even then. My suitcase landed beside me. The zipper burst open on impact. Socks, sweaters, a folded blazer, and the notebook spilled across the threshold. The gold watch slid to the edge of the porch, spinning once before settling. I gathered what I could, slowly, deliberately. The rain soaked through my sleeves, into my collar. My shoulder throbbed where it had struck the banister. My hands shook, but not from fear. I stood. They expected me to cry, to collapse, to beg, but I didn't. My voice, when it came, was clear. "You'll regret this," I said. Not because of the money, not even because of the violence, but because you think I won't fight. And I bent to pick up the pocket watch. It was still ticking. I turned away from the house, once mine, always theirs, and stepped out into the storm. The rain washed the blood from my hairline. The suitcase wheels scraped against stone. Behind me, the door closed. Not with a slam, but with a kind of finality that made it clear. This wasn't just an exit, it was a severance, and I didn't look back. Because if Edward had taught me anything, it was this legacy isn't built by those who inherit, it's built by those who endure. Samantha didn't ask questions when she saw the bruises blooming along my collarbone or the dried blood at my hairline. She simply opened the passenger door, turned on the seat warmers, and kept one hand steady on the wheel the entire drive to her apartment. I sat in silence, clutching the suitcase they had tried to rip from my grip. Inside it was everything I had left my documents. Edward's notebook, a damp blazer, and the old gold pocket watch. That night, wrapped in a borrowed blanket on Samantha's worn gray couch, I couldn't sleep. My body ached, but it wasn't the pain that kept me awake. It was the question echoing through every corner of my mind. What would Edward have done? He knew. On some level, he must have known they'd come for me. Why else would he write those words? Just hold the line. I reached for the pocket watch on the coffee table. It was heavier than I remembered. Its surface was smooth, but something in the weight felt wrong, off balance, like it was holding more than time. I ran my thumb along the back, tracing the edges, and felt it. An almost imperceptible seam. A memory stirred. The rhythm Edward used to open his desk drawer, 2, 3, 2. I pressed the panel. Click. The back popped open. Inside, nestled in a small chamber no bigger than a coin, was a folded note, yellowed at the edges, and a USB drive. I unfolded the paper slowly. The handwriting was his, precise, confident. If they've done what I feared, go to Archer Glass in Brighton Court. He'll know what to do. I stared at it, the words vibrating in my chest like a heartbeat I hadn't heard in days. Edward hadn't left me alone. He hadn't just trusted me. He'd prepared for this. Samantha walked in quietly with a mug of tea. She paused when she saw the open watch and the flash drive resting in my hand. "That from your grandfather," I nodded. He knew they'd try to undo everything. We booted up her laptop. The folder was simply labeled CW, my initials. Inside were subfolders, each named with precision medical evaluations, board minutes, audio recordings, contingency protocols. There were scanned documents from Edward's doctors, every one of them confirming his mental clarity in the months before his death. Signed, stamped, dated. Then came the audio files. I pressed play on the first one. Edward's voice filled the room. Steady, sharp. "If you're listening to this, Madeline, then you already know how far they're willing to go. But what matters now is what you know." In another recording, we were sitting together discussing board appointments, ethics clauses, and shareholder leverage. He spoke of me not as a girl learning, but as a successor preparing. "She doesn't posture," he said. "She plans. And when the time comes, she'll lead better than any of them ever could." There were spreadsheets, too, meticulously detailed ledgers connected to both domestic and offshore accounts. One folder labeled emergency funds, another tagged CWW. I didn't know what it all meant yet, but I knew enough to understand this wasn't just a defense, it was a blueprint. Edward hadn't just trusted me with his legacy. He had documented every decision, every conversation, every piece of truth they would try to erase. And now, it was mine to hold, mine to protect. I looked down at the USB in my hand. It was small, ordinary, but in the right courtroom, it would be louder than any accusation, louder than any lie. I opened my laptop and typed a single message. Subject, per Edward Carter. To Archer, Glass at Bry Court Legal. Calm body. Edward Carter said you'd know what to do. Madeline C. 3 hours later, a reply appeared. Come immediately. You're not alone in this. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled. The war wasn't over. But now, at least, I had a map. Brighton Court didn't look like the kind of place where revolutions began, tucked behind a row of brick townhouses. Archer Glass's office sat above an old tailor's shop, its sign faded, its windows clean but unremarkable. The kind of place people pass every day without noticing. The kind of place Edward Carter would have trusted with a legacy. Quiet, unassuming, unshakable. Archer met me at the door with a firm handshake and eyes that didn't blink when I said my name. You look like him, he said. stepping aside to let me in. Same posture. Same way of not apologizing for taking up space. The office smelled like varnished wood and old paper. He motioned toward a file cabinet marked with a brass plaque. Carter. Edward. Then he opened it and pulled out a thick folder labeled Contingency Protocols. He came to me the day after his diagnosis. Archer said, flipping through the pages. Said he didn't trust the family anymore. Said you were the only one who hadn't been compromised. He didn't ask what had happened at Silverfield. He didn't need to. Instead, he introduced me to Jenna Whitmore, a litigation attorney whose specialty wasn't just estate law, but conflict, the kind where blood and money were inseparable. She arrived 20 minutes later with a laptop, a legal pad, and the kind of calm that doesn't flinch. Even when you describe being dragged down a marble staircase by your father, her only question was, "Do you have documentation?" I handed her the USB. Archer watched in silence as Jenna connected it to her laptop. For the next 3 hours, we didn't speak much, just the quiet clicking of keys, the occasional murmur of recognition, names, dates, transaction records, medical evaluations, audio files. "This isn't just strong," Jenna said finally. "This is surgical. Your grandfather didn't just leave you assets, he left you an entire litigation strategy." She laid out the plan with the precision of someone who'd done this before, establish Edward's mental clarity beyond doubt, expose any forgery or undue influence attempts, and file for an emergency injunction to reinstate the terms of the original will, while initiating civil and potential criminal proceedings against anyone who tampered with estate documents. "And we start now," she said. "Over the next week." I stayed in the guest room above Archer's office. The room was modest. One bed, one chair, a desk facing the street, but it was safe, and that was something I hadn't felt in weeks. While Jenna and Archer assembled the case, I worked beside them, reviewing files line by line, listening to hours of Edward's voice. Sometimes he spoke about companies' bylaws, other times about ethics, about legacy, about the cost of protecting something no one else understands. "Do not try to be admired," he once said. "Try to be immovable." Those words followed me through the long hours and into the early mornings. Every document we found, every inconsistency in their story, every signature forged in haste, was one more stone in the foundation we were rebuilding. Jenna filed the emergency injunction 3 days later. The paperwork was thick, the exhibits damning, the court date expedited. "They tried to make you unstable," she said, packing up her bag. "Now we show them what stability actually looks like." That night, I stood by the window of the guest room, watching the fog settle over Brighton Court. Down below, someone walked their dog past the tailor's shop. No one glanced up. No one knew what we were building here. And that was fine, because this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving I belonged. It was about holding the line, exactly as Edward had asked me to. And I wasn't holding it alone anymore. The first crack didn't come from a confession. It came from a spreadsheet. Jenna was combing through account activity from Carter Maritime when she paused, leaned in, and let out the kind of breath that always precedes something bigger. "Tell me," she said, "does AV Solutions mean anything to you?" I shook my head. "Never heard of it." She turned the screen toward me. A shell corporation. No website. No employees. No office address. And yet, over $480,000 in consulting fees had been routed through it in the 3 months following Edward's death. Payment memos marked with vague terms, strategy advisement, restructuring services, and legacy realignment. "Who's listed as the beneficiary?" I asked, though I could feel the answer forming before the page loaded. "Lillian Carter." I stared at the name like it didn't belong to my sister anymore. In truth, maybe it never had. She'd vanished to Europe just 2 weeks after the will was read. At least that was the story my parents had floated at dinner parties. Jenna dug deeper. Travel records, customs logs. Nothing. Lillian hadn't left the country. She'd been in Atlantic City, then Vegas, casinos, ATM withdrawals, luxury hotels, no business trips, no strategy meetings. She wasn't traveling. Jenna murmured. She was covering her tracks. It got worse. Archer traced the AV Solutions payments back to internal approvals from Carter Maritime's discretionary fund, one that required board oversight. But the approval signatures were missing. The digital authorizations led back to a single user, Gregory North, our former estate attorney. Benjamin Holloway had handed me the will. Gregory had started the war to undo it. That same afternoon, Archer uncovered metadata from a PDF labeled Final Mental Evaluation, Edward Carter. It looked official, sealed, signed, dated 1 month before Edward's passing. But the doctor's signature didn't match any of the verified records from the USB. Jenna ran it through a handwriting verification tool. The results were clear forged. Then came the final nail. The document had been created 2 weeks after Edward's death. The metadata, though partially scrubbed, still showed traces of its origin. Gregory North's work laptop, the same laptop he had used for estate filings. The same man who claimed he had only ever followed Edward's wishes. Jenna stood by the window, arms crossed, staring out into the evening fog. "They didn't just try to remove you," she said. "They tried to fabricate a version of the past where you were never named." I sat in silence, trying to process what that meant. They hadn't acted out of grief. They hadn't panicked. This was deliberate, coordinated. A campaign to erase Edward's choice and replace it with their convenience. I opened the forged medical note again. It looked convincing at first glance. Clinical language, official stamps, even a paragraph about possible cognitive decline due to age. But it was the final line, scrawled in a hand that wasn't medical at all, that chilled me. Monitor for signs of undue influence. They wanted to paint me as manipulative, as a threat, a girl who wormed her way into an old man's confidence and stole what didn't belong to her. They didn't just want the money. They wanted the story rewritten, so thoroughly, so cruelly, that no one would ever question it again. But Edward had prepared for this. Every document on that USB wasn't just proof of his mental clarity. It was evidence of something deeper: his intention, his trust, his foresight. He hadn't just taught me how to lead. He'd left me the tools to defend the right to do so. "Your sister isn't just complicit," Jenna said, turning back to me. "She's a liability, and they've spent the last 3 months trying to hide it." I nodded, slowly. The fog outside was thick now, curling around the window like breath on glass. "They thought I was the problem," I said. "No," Archer corrected. "They thought you were alone." But I wasn't. Not anymore. And now we had enough to bring down every lie they'd built, brick by forged brick. The courtroom didn't look like justice. It looked like wood paneling and worn carpet and fluorescent lights that hummed too loudly above a row of chairs that never quite felt comfortable. But when you've had your name dragged through the mud by your own blood, comfort isn't what you come for. You come for clarity. You come to finish what they started. I sat at the plaintiff's table in a navy blazer that still smelled faintly of Samantha's laundry soap. Jenna sat beside me, calm and razor-sharp. Archer was just behind us, a quiet pillar in a gray wool coat. The bench before us was stacked with files, paper trails, financial records, recordings, sworn affidavits, and one black USB drive resting in a velvet case. Across the aisle, Barbara sat with her spine straight and her pearls heavier than ever. David flanked her, his expression locked in the permanent squint of a man who could still almost convince himself this was all beneath him. Lillian was behind them, silent, head down. She didn't look at me, not once. The judge entered, Judge Morales. Sharp, unreadable. She adjusted her glasses, reviewed the docket, and nodded once. Let's begin. Jenna led with the will. A certified copy. Clear language. Clear intent. Edward Carter, fully sound of mind, named me as sole heir to the Silverfield estate. Carter Maritime's controlling shares, and all related assets. Then came the medical records. Scans from 3 independent physicians, all confirming his mental clarity in the final 6 months of his life. Next, the audio recordings. Edward's voice filled the courtroom, strong and deliberate. She doesn't posture, he said in one clip. She plans. And when I'm gone, she'll carry this better than any of them ever could. You could feel the room shift. Even the court reporter looked up. Then Jenna called Mr. Alton to the stand. I saw Mr. Carter and Miss Carter discussing business almost daily. He said he was proud of her, trusted her, never once questioned her judgment. And on the day she was removed from the home, Jenna asked. His voice dropped. I saw Mr. Carter drag her by the hair down the staircase. I should have spoken sooner. But I'm speaking now. And finally, she played the video. Edward sat in his study, the lighting low, his expression unmistakably serious. He looked directly into the camera. If you're watching this, he said, then they tried to undo my choice. They may rewrite the paper, but they cannot rewrite intent. You could have heard a pin drop. The judge leaned forward, hands folded. Then she turned to the defense. Gregory North, red-faced and suddenly too small for his tailored suit, muttered something about questionable influence, about family tension, about Edward's condition. But the forged document had already been exposed. Jenna rose for the final time. Your Honor, what they've done isn't just morally reprehensible, it's criminal. This isn't about inheritance. It's about identity. About trying to erase a woman who dared to stand where they thought she didn't belong. Judge Morales didn't deliberate long. She glanced down at the files, then back up at me. This court finds the will to be valid and legally binding. All assets, properties, and holdings are to be reinstated in full to Ms. Madeline Carter. Furthermore, criminal referrals will be issued regarding document forgery and fraudulent concealment. Her gavel fell. Barbara's mouth parted, as if she had one more plea left in her throat. But no one wanted to hear it. David turned crimson, then gray. Gregory sat back, defeated. Lillian didn't move. I stood, not with triumph, but with something heavier, something steadier. I hadn't won a fortune, I had reclaimed a truth. I walked out of that courtroom, not alone, not ashamed, and no longer invisible. The story they tried to rewrite was now sealed. And this time, it bore my name. ChatGPT'd and I. The papers were delivered the next morning, hand-stamped, time-stamped, and final. 30 days. No extensions. The estate was no longer under dispute. All occupants not listed under the Carter Trust were to vacate Silverfield immediately. They were allowed to take personal belongings. Nothing more. Nothing that bore Edward's name. Or mine. I didn't return right away. I waited 3 days. I let the silence do what the law never could, settle into the corners of the house. Peel back the polish. I wanted the walls to remember the difference between power taken and power earned. When I finally walked through the wrought iron gates, Silverfield no longer looked like a monument. It looked like memory. The gravel crunched under my shoes in a rhythm I hadn't heard since I was a child, trailing behind Edward's stride. The front door opened without resistance. No guards, no shouts, just stillness. Inside, the rooms felt larger than I remembered, not because they'd changed, but because I had. The portraits were still there. Edward in his navy blazer, beside a model of the Eleanor, a family photo, years old. where I stood just slightly out of frame. I didn't stop to look. I didn't need to. The staff didn't meet my eyes. Some looked surprised. Others looked relieved. No one asked questions. And I didn't offer answers. Loyalty is complicated in houses where power shifts hands like wind. I didn't blame them for surviving. I only expected them not to lie. Barbara called 3 times that afternoon. I didn't pick up. She left no voicemails. Just silence. Wrapped in caller ID. David didn't call. He sent an email. Subject: "This is beneath you." Body: "Think carefully about the image you're creating. Revenge isn't leadership. This isn't over." I left it unread. But Lillian didn't send a message. She came in person. I found her waiting at the gate in a tan coat. No driver, no entourage. She held a small box in her hands, no bigger than a jewelry case. "I'm not here to ask for anything," she said when I stepped outside. "Just to give you this." She opened the box and held it out to me. Inside were Edward's gold cufflinks, the ones with the etched sailboats, the ones I'd seen him wear at every board meeting, every birthday, every Saturday dinner, the ones that had vanished after the funeral. "Dad sold them," Lillian admitted. "I bought them back." I stared at them, the gold catching what little sunlight broke through the clouds. I didn't reach for them. Not yet. "Why now?" I asked. Her voice was quiet. Not weak. Just honest. "I didn't know how to stop them," she said, "and maybe I didn't want to. But I think you did." I nodded. "Just once." Then I took the box. She didn't ask to come in. I didn't invite her. We stood there a moment longer. The silence not heavy, not cold, just unfinished. She turned and walked back toward the road. I watched her go, cufflinks warm in my palm. That night, I opened the drawer of Edward's desk, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar and ink, and placed the cufflinks inside, not as an heirloom, not as a symbol, but as a line finally closed. Silverfield was no longer a house where I lived quietly under someone else's story. It was mine now. And this time, no one had to disappear to make space for me to exist. That night, the house was quiet in a way it had never been before. Not hollow, not tense, just still. The kind of silence that settles after something has finally ended, after the storm, after the verdict, after the voices that tried to drown you have gone hoarse from shouting. I walked the halls of Silverfield barefoot, letting the warmth of the wood floors ground me. The walls no longer pressed in. The ceilings no longer loomed. This house, which once held its breath every time I entered a room, had finally exhaled. In my hand was the box Lillian had left behind. I carried it with the same care Edward once reserved for his favorite books. Not because of what it was worth, but because of what it meant. I opened the door to his study slowly. The scent of cedar and old ink still lingered, soft and stubborn. Time hadn't erased him from this room, and neither had they. I sat at his desk and opened the drawer where he kept the things he trusted: a silver pen, a sailing compass. The corner of a yellow notepad still curled beneath a file marked Legacy, Private. I placed the cufflinks inside, right where they belonged. Then I closed the drawer, and I locked it. Not to keep the world out, but to keep the truth in, because not all memory needs to be carried. Some of it just needs to be honored and left where it can't be twisted again. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was borrowing space, or asking permission to exist. The rooms no longer whispered what I wasn't. They waited patiently to learn who I would become. I stood and turned off the light in the study, not to erase him, but to remind myself that legacy doesn't live in rooms. It lives in what we choose to build next. As I walked back through the house, my house, there was no one left to cast shadows across my name, no voices calling me small, no hands holding me back. Silverfield was quiet. not because it had been emptied, but it had finally been returned. And I, Madeline Carter, was no longer the girl trying to be seen. I was the woman no one could make invisible again. They tried to rewrite the story without me, but I was the ending they didn't see coming. Silverfield is mine now, not just the house, but the history, the future, the name. And I didn't have to scream to be heard. I just had to hold the line. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment, share it, and don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the quietest ones rewrite everything.